Well, thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you all today. I'm very excited to be here. As Star said, I'm a graduate of the University of Southern Maine and for both my bachelor's and my master's. And, it holds a special place in my heart. So, I'm thrilled to be able to speak to you all today. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about slavery and the slave trade in Maine and New England. And the title of my talk today is Have We a Slaver in Portland Harbor, Maine and the Slave Trade? And the image you see here is an unknown slave ship that was being pursued by the Royal Navy in the 1840s or 1850s. And this is in the collection of the Penobscot Marine Museum. So slavery was a trade that really created the world that we live in. It touched nearly every continent on Earth in some way. Trade was driven by waterways. So the trade in enslaved people began around the 15th century and really began with the coinciding of a bunch of different events. Number one, the quote unquote discovery of the New World by Europeans, the development of ships that could get past the currents of the west coast of Africa. Of course, we're all familiar with the jet stream that goes from the east coast of the United States across the Atlantic Ocean to the west coast of Africa. And prior to 1400 or so, it was impossible for vessels, given the technology, to make it past these difficult currents along the windward coast. So these vessels really began transporting enslaved people from from the west coast of Africa around 1400, 1500. And people were transported both to the mainland United States and the rest of the Americas, as well as to Europe. And there was also a changing in rules in the late 15th century within the Catholic Church, primarily within the Spanish colonies, that disallowed using indigenous people as slaves in favor of their conversion after the massive population decline of early colonization via violence and disease. And slavery, global slavery, had a massive human toll. It had an average mortality rate of about 15%, yet at times, particularly in the period that I'm going to focus on today in the 19th century, the mortality rate was 30% or higher. And we don't truly know the full scope of the slave trade. We know how many people, an estimate of how many people were transported aboard vessels from Africa to the New World, but we don't know how many people were killed in the intra-African slave trade. So the trade from the interior of Africa along the riverways to the coasts before enslaved people ended up at slave castles and fortresses to be transported to the New World. And obviously this had massive demographic changes in Africa. It caused huge destabilization in the societies and cultures of Africa that persist to the present day. I mean, a lot of the wars and the ongoing strife that we see in many African nations are caused as a direct result of the legacies of slavery and colonialism in Africa. So the slave trade is something that we are only really beginning to reckon with. But what we know is at least 12.5 million people were embarked from Africa, but only 10.7 million disembarked in the New World. So that difference of 1.8 million is the mortality rate, the number of people that we know that died, that perished in the Middle Passage, which is about 14.5% of all people that were embarked from Africa. So this is obviously a huge human toll, and one to which we may never know the full scope. And Maine really played a role in this. Slavery in colonial New England was a rather small institution, but we do know that the first enslaved person had arrived in Maine by 1663 when there was a deed in the town of York from Thomas Bolt, who gave his son-in-law, quote, a Negro boy named Mingo, end quote. By 1715, there were approximately 2,000 enslaved people in the colony of Massachusetts Bay. By 1775, there were 3,500 enslaved people in Massachusetts and 629 in New Hampshire. In New York, at the same time, by comparison, there were 15,000 enslaved people in that state. But that does not mean that slavery was any less brutal or vicious in the state of Maine or the rest of New England during that time period. Lorenzo Johnston Green, who is one of the fathers of the study of slavery in New England, who wrote his books in the 1940s and 1950s, noted that a slaveholder named Nathaniel Kane beat an enslaved woman named Rachel to death in Maine in 1695. And of course, many people may be familiar with William Pepperell, who was a wealthy merchant and son-in-law of a slave trader who had a large house in Kittery Point. And he purchased 5 captives from to be brought to Kittery from Antigua in 1719. In a letter dated June 25th, 1719, merchant Benjamin Bullard, who Pepperell had hired, stated, quote, "Sir, I received yours by Captain Morris with bills of lading for 5 Negroes and 1 hogshead of rum. 1 Negro woman marked Y on the left breast died in about 3 weeks after her arrival, in spite of medical aid which I procured. All the rest died at sea. I am sorry for your loss. It may have resulted in deficient clothing so early in the spring." Which essentially means that these people froze to death because of the conditions aboard the vessel being transported to Maine. And Pepperell was known for having been one of the, excuse me for the dogs, was known to have been one of the largest slaveholders in the state of Maine at the time, and was a really wealthy merchant who was said to have sailed down the Piscataqua on a large barge attended by several captive Africans, a clear sign of his wealth to all that saw him, that he was not only this wealthy merchant, but also connected to the rest of the world through his merchant activities. We do not know a whole lot about slavery in colonial Maine, but what we do know is there was at least a slave market in the town of York by 1650. By 1754, there was approximately 154 enslaved men and women in the Maine. And we don't really know, though, how many enslaved people actually lived here, as the recording of these types of censuses were pretty sparse at that time period. So we do know a little bit about Maine and the legal slave trade. So the period prior to 1808, when the slave trade was abolished by the United States, but not a lot. What we do know is difficult to get at this point, because there has really been a lack of research. I'm one of the first people to really focus on the state of Maine and looking at the slave trade. So we're just now beginning to get a picture of how Maine and the rest of New England played a role in the global slave trade. There's quite a lot more known about a state like Rhode Island, which had significant slave trading activities and has long been known to have been part of this triangular trade, which was the previous interpretation of the slave trade. Now scholars were really pushing more towards something like a circle, which shows a much fuller picture of the slave trade, that it was not just this one-way route, but there was a lot of things happening back and forth throughout the globe. There's also just a general misunderstanding of the slave trade by the vast majority of people. We tend to think that slave ships were slave ships and other ships were other ships transporting merchant goods. And that's just not the case. There are actually very few ships that were built specifically for the purpose of trading enslaved people. The vast majority of people were transported aboard ships that transported all kinds of goods, that were involved in other merchant activities. Not every journey they made was a slave trading journey, but those vessels still acted at times as slave ships. There are new ongoing collaborative projects like the SlaveX project, which I'm involved in, as well as slavevoyages.org, which I'm also involved in, which is the largest database of the transatlantic slave trade. And I would definitely encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about the global slave trade, to go on there and look at the resources available that truly show the effects of the global slave trade. Another problem that we have is that records are sparse, because many of these records are kind of hidden in private collections, family collections, smaller historical societies, which may not have been able to digitize their records yet, or even in our larger historical societies and museums who have not really correctly or previously had not cataloged these items as being related to slavery. They may be cataloged as something else, and unless you know what you're looking for, it's difficult to find them and identify them. And of course, finally, there's a lack of support for this type of scholarship in institutions of higher learning in New England. The elimination of for example, American and New England Studies program, which I'm a graduate of, really has limited this study for folks in the humanities who want to pursue this type of research in Northern New England. So there's new collaborations such as Reimagining New England Histories, which is out of Brown and Mystic Seaport Museum, and other projects that are beginning to happen that really are exploring this history. So hopefully within the next decade, we'll know a lot more about this research because of ongoing collaborations like these and Atlantic Black Box, which I'm also involved in. But we do know some about the legal trade of enslaved people in Maine. Like I said, we know that there was a colonial slave market in the town of York by 1650, but we have only a really small, scant amount of evidence for Maine's role in the slave trade prior to 1800. We do know that enslaved people were being brought directly from Africa to Maine, or by way of other American ports, prior to the abolition of slavery in the state of Massachusetts in 1784. This example above is a letter from Alexander Rate to a newspaper stating that on June 22nd, 1752, a slave ship called the Betsy, which was captained by Samuel Lanphier, arrived from the coast of Guinea with a load of enslaved people for sale. We also know of a small handful of other vessels, which you can see on the right, the Knutsford, with approximately 200 people on board, the Hereford with approximately 287 people on board, and the Rising Sun, which wrecked with all on board. And these vessels were not bound for Maine, they were bound for other places in the Americas for selling these people, but the vessels themselves and the crews were all from Maine. But prior to the American Revolution, Massachusetts citizens had made at least two attempts to stop the trade in enslaved Africans. But these attempts were not favored by the colonial governor, and therefore they didn't go anywhere. Rhode Island and Connecticut did pass resolutions barring the importation of enslaved Africans to their borders, but none of the colonial powers made any attempts at limiting the engagement of their citizens in the traffic in enslaved Africans elsewhere, particularly to the Caribbean, which I think we're all pretty familiar with, Rhode Island having been very important in the trade in enslaved people from Africa to the Caribbean. It was not until 1787 that Rhode Island passed the first law in New England barring the participation of its citizens in the foreign slave trade, which levied a 1,000 pound fine for fitting out a vessel and an additional 100 pounds per captive, which is a very large fine for the time. However, it was very sparsely enforced. And that's a theme that you'll see throughout this presentation, that unfortunately, the enforcement of all of these policies and rules to stop the slave trade were often only weakly enforced, or really only enforced at times when certain people were in power that were, trying to stop the slave trade. So Massachusetts and Connecticut followed Rhode Island's lead in 1788 with similar legislation. However, the legislative situation was confused by questions of jurisdiction and constitutionality, all of which tended to aid the slave trader and to increase the zeal of abolitionists for federal rather than state action. However, the 1788 law did make it illegal for Maine and Massachusetts citizens to participate in the slave trade. And one example that we do have in a collection of early example of Mainers breaking this law is the ship Eagle. And this set of materials is found at the Maine Historical Society. It's in the collection, the Robeson family collection. Essentially in 1791, Thomas Hodges purchased enslaved people in Africa with the intention of selling them along with other cargo from Maine, such as rum and other trade goods like flour, in Lakai, Haiti. And Hodges and the vessel's captain, Henry Skinner, decided to stop in Havana to sell enslaved people, as the port had recently been opened to the trade. However, Skinner and Hodges knew they could make more money in French colonies. Because of the restrictions on American trade at the time, Americans were not allowed to sell enslaved people in French colonies. To bypass this, Hodges, at the behest of the vessel's owner, rum merchant Thomas Robeson, transferred 29 people into a French vessel, La Jarime, and sold the enslaved people there in Haiti for a large profit. This document on the left records the prices paid by each purchaser for the enslaved people. Upon the discovery of this transaction back in Maine, Hodges and Skinner were taken to court in 1792 and were found guilty and fined 200 pounds for fitting out the ship and 50 pounds for each person sold, having violated the 1788 Act that Massachusetts passed, barring participation in the foreign slave trade. And scholar Elizabeth Donnan, who was writing in the 1930s, argued that merchants like Robeson nearly immediately began trading in enslaved people after the American Revolution had put a halt to the inhumane traffic. She stated, quote, "Remembering the profits of earlier days, merchants whose fortunes had been shattered by war might well look to the slave traffic to restore their vanished estates. Captains and seamen so habituated to the commerce in blacks that it offered no offense to conscience were still available." End quote. So this is a good transition to talking about the illegal slave trade. So the legal participation of American ships in the foreign slave trade ended in 1808 after the British had passed an act to abolish the slave trade in 1807 and really petitioned strongly to other foreign governments to abolish their participation in the slave trade. Of course, what's interesting is that while they barred participation in the slave trade, Great Britain did not abolish slavery in their colonies until the 1830s. So slavery still persisted in British colonies for another couple of decades after the abolition of the slave trade. There were some ships that still sailed to the American mainland illegally. Most entered ports in the Gulf and Southeast coasts. The most famous is the ship Clotilda, which landed in Mobile, Alabama in 1862. And there's quite a lot out there right now about the Clotilda if you're interested in learning more about that vessel. Interestingly enough, the men who owned the ship were from Maine, the Meaher brothers, they had moved down to Mobile and started a steamship building company, and had bet essentially that they could sneak a slave ship from Africa past the American Union blockades and land enslaved people in Mobile, and they did so. And there is a strong descendant community in Africatown, Alabama, which is in Mobile, who remember this vessel, and the vessel was actually recently discovered, having been sunk intentionally in Mobile. There were few voyages that landed in the United States proper, however, in comparison to the numbers of American vessels that landed in Cuba and Brazil during this time period, the illegal period. There are several reasons why this is the case, why it was difficult for slave ships to land in the United States, particularly after the 1820s. Number one is American ports were largely being trafficked and watched over by naval vessels, by other sorts of governmental bodies. Of course, we all know that there's all kinds of customs and other things that ships have to enter and when they arrive in the United States. So those would have been difficult to sneak past. A second reason is that enslaved Africans would not have spoken English, or they may have had an accent, and they would have been suspect at sale at these auction facilities. And generally speaking, when enslaved people were being sold, particularly along the coastwise United States, they had to essentially swear that they were lawful slaves, so that they had been purchased legally and had not been born outside of the United States. And another reason is that, of course, you can't escape the tax man. Ships had to pay taxes and tariffs, and it would have been easy to get caught. And the U.S. government was very interested in collecting these taxes and tariffs from vessels. So in 1808, this law was passed, but there was very little penalty for people caught. And during the period between 1808 and 1820, the slave trade really continued on unabated. There was very little in the way of U.S. government desire to do much to suppress the traffic. There was no specific navy. There was no there were no bodies that really wanted to stop this. So there were some subsequent laws passed in 1818, 1819, and 1820 that really began to push down on the traffic and attempt to penalize those participating in it more. And so in the final act of 1820, which incidentally enough was being argued at Congress at the exact same moment as Maine statehood was being argued in spring of 1820, was passed, which made it a crime of piracy and thus punishable by death. And even that did not stop anyone really from participating in the traffic. And we don't see anyone actually put to death until 1862, when Portland ship captain Nathaniel Gordon was put to death essentially at the behest of the Lincoln administration due to their desire to stop this traffic, which had been going unabated. And in the late 1850s and early 1860s, it was out of control. Massive numbers of enslaved people being transported by American ships, which I'll talk about in a little while. So essentially, very few people were ever seriously punished. People were brought up on charges fairly regularly. Most of the people that I'll talk about today, I know about because they were brought up on charges of some kind. They were either captured by the Americans or they were captured by the British. And yet generally speaking, the most serious crimes that the most serious punishment they received was fines, which, when we're talking about the amount of money being made on these journeys, was very little. And I'll briefly talk about the trade, the domestic slave trade, which is also something that has really not been studied significantly. I think it's now beginning to get more attention from institutions in Maine. So these two documents on the left here are slave ship manifests. So when a legal journey took place along the domestic U.S. coastwise route, a slave ship manifest had to be issued. And this is a legal document issued by the customs authorities in each port when a ship that was carrying enslaved people would enter or exit to go from one port to another. These two vessels here were owned by Rufus Soule of Freeport. You can see that on the left, the brig Venus, which was also captained by Francis Soule, I believe. That vessel landed in 1845 in Baltimore and transported an enslaved child named Mary, who was 15 years old, on behalf of a slave trader named Richard Cromwell to New Orleans. And this is a very common route, particularly during this period. Millions of enslaved people were transported from the upper South to the lower South, particularly this Baltimore to New Orleans route. And if you're interested in learning more about this, you can go to slavevoyages.org and look at the Oceans of Kinfolk database, which discusses this route. And the other vessel is the brig Susan Soule, named after Rufus's wife. And this vessel transported Caroline and her two children, 6-year-old Harry and 1-year-old Godfrey, from Charleston to New Orleans in 1848. And so these people were being transported along with other trade goods aboard the vessel. Cotton, manufactured goods, of course, by this time period from the American Industrial Revolution. We know a bit about this because some of these records have been digitized. However, there's a significant number of these records that are still sitting in the National Archives collections here in Maryland, in Georgia, Texas, and other places in the United States. And many of these records have been destroyed over time because of disasters, fires, floods. All of the records from Boston, for example, were destroyed in a fire. So we may never know Maine's full participation in the legal slave trade, but what we do have is this kind of evidence that this was happening. And often this was happening, from what I've found, alongside in the same journeys that vessels would transport enslaved people from Baltimore to New Orleans and leave from New Orleans to go to Africa and purchase more enslaved people in Africa and take them to Brazil or Cuba, which I'll talk about a little later. So I'm going to pivot now to talking about one of these slave traders from Maine. And this is, one of these complicated stories that we deal with when we're trying to study, particularly this period. We will never find a manifest. So there's no manifest that exists that lists enslaved people like the ones I just showed you, because what they were doing was illegal. So evidence was purposely hidden or destroyed. So we have to sort of find evidence in a backward fashion. So Ebenezer Farwell was born in Vassalboro. He was part of the Farwell family, who was a significant family in Vassalboro. The little house you see here on the bottom right is his father's house, which is on the National Register of Historic Places. His father was considered, a founder of Vassalboro. Essentially, Farwell was a captain of a number of vessels. The first vessel that I found that he was involved in was this ship, the Transit, which was built in 1829 by Johnson Williams in Brunswick. And it was 199 tons, which essentially means the tonnage of a vessel doesn't mean how much the vessel itself weighs, but it means how much cargo weight it can carry without being unsteady on the water. So in 1838, the vessel was captained by Farwell, and it goes to Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire and returns into the port of New York City with 3 enslaved Africans on board. And a 4th enslaved African named Yazi, having been left at his father's home, which you see on the right, to work as a, quote, indentured servant. And so this whole thing was found out, which by this point was well illegal. Of course, this is 30 years after the law has been passed, by David Ruggles, who was an important Black abolitionist in the port of New York City. And essentially the abolitionists and the Black community that lived around the docks rescued these men. And so he was charged with breaking this law and breaking the 1818 law. And he had essentially, he was brought up on charges. And this is from the Daily Current from September 8th, 1838, and it states, in order to disprove the allegation that he intended to sell these men as slaves, Captain Farwell produced 2 papers, one of which was an agreement he made with 3 of these Africans, and the other a separate agreement with Yazzie to pay them and him so much per month for their services in assisting to navigate his ship from Africa to New York. An attempt was made to discredit these statements, and Mr. Ruggles and another colored man named Slauson deposed that they were acquainted with the handwriting of a man named Hughes, now in Africa, whose name is subscribed as a witness to the agreement made with these Africans, and that they did not believe this to be his handwriting. Judge Betts decided that the law prohibiting the bringing of native Africans to the US did not prohibit the bringing of free men here to do involuntary labor. That's something that should sink in. That did not prohibit the bringing of native Africans here to do involuntary labor. The court discharged the complaint on the ground that labor must be involuntary or what is tantamount to slavery, or it does not come within the provision of the law. So essentially, despite the fact that these men asserted when they were deposed that they were enslaved, that they did not agree to come to the United States, Farwell produced some documents stating that he had freed them prior to their arrival and was let off. And this is something that happens over and over again in these cases, that the law is on the side of the slave trader and not on the side of the enslaved, that the burden of proof to prove that they were actually enslaved was so high that it's almost impossible to find people guilty in these situations. So Farwell returns to Vassalboro and builds this huge house that you see here. Obviously, this is directly next door to that little cape that his father built. It's completely sticks out in a town like Vassalboro, this giant Greek revival building. So he begins building this in 1839, and by 1840, he is essentially running low on money and can't finish the house. And he decides to take another trip to Africa. So he begins to captain the Plymouth schooner, the Mary Carver, to Liberia once again. So Farwell and the crew go to Liberia, and there is a serious disagreement here in from what the U.S. Navy states happened to them versus what the people from Africa stated happened. So essentially here, they land on the border between Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, what is now the Bota border, and interact with the Beriberi tribe. And something happens. So according to the Beriberi, they are trying to, Carver and his crew are trying to purchase enslaved people. And when the emissaries from the Beriberi king go on to the Mary Carver, there is a disagreement over money or something like that. And they kill, the crew of the Mary Carver kill these emissaries. And as a result, the Beriberi attack the Mary Carver, they sink the ship, and they kill all of the occupants on board. So retribution for this act was absolutely brutal. At the same time period in 1842, the United States had signed the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which did three things. Number one, it interestingly enough, it resolved the northern boundary of Maine because of the Aristic Wars. So it resolved that, you know, the boundary was the St. John River. The second thing it did was the United States and Great Britain came to an agreement over the slave ship, the Creole, which, if you're familiar with the Amistad, had similar results. The enslaved people were being transported along the domestic coastwise United States route. They revolted on board, sailed the ship to the Bahamas, and once they landed on free soil in the Bahamas, the British government said they were free. The United States government and the slaveholders said that they needed to return these people, and essentially a conflict ensued for several years, and this resolved that yes, the enslaved people were free. And the final thing it did was the United States agreed to commission ships specifically for the slave trade, for enforcing the abolition of the slave trade. And so one of the first vessels launched is this vessel you see here, the U.S. sloop of war Saratoga, which was built at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. And this other image on the below right is the first crew of the Saratoga, which are almost certainly the men involved in this incident in reprisal for what happened aboard the Mary Carver. So essentially, in 1842, they launched the ship, and the first thing they do is go to Liberia. And this is this central image here is from a diary that was written by one of the sailors that you see here. And this is in the Maine Historical Society. And it talks about what they essentially did. They decided that they would enact violence on these various villages along the coast of Liberia under the guise that they were punishing those who were involved in the Mary Carver incident. However, it became very clear almost immediately that the members of the Berry tribe who had executed the crew of the Mary Carver had actually perished separately prior to their arrival. And the path of destruction that this ship laid was much longer and further than anything having to do with the Mary Carver. And so this middle image states, the sailor states that as soon as I was behind the line, I could move about pretty freely and soon became possessed of a very strong desire to shoot somebody, but could not see a shot sufficiently certain to expend my charge, knowing that before I could load again, they would be too far off to hit. So I ran towards the natives escaping on our left, but seeing two others in the water, it appeared a most beautiful chance, and I went to give it to them. I could have loaded and fired frequently, for no matter how deep they dived, they would have come to the surface again to blow. The purser also came along with the intent to kill, and we were just drawing bead on them when we learned that they were crewmen from the Macedonian, which was another ship traveling with Saratoga. So we spared them and those who had taken to the water, lest they might be mistaken for natives. And afterwards, I kept others from shooting at them. So they proceed essentially to burn 50 to 100 villages and kill indiscriminately men, women, and children throughout this region, besides the Berry tribe. And even the king of the Berry was murdered during what was supposed to be a peaceful palaver between Commodore Turner, the captain of the Saratoga, and Commodore Perry and his men. So this is just an example. What we can really interpret from this is that the United States at the same time period was aggressively trying to colonize Liberia, and Liberia becomes a very important site of the American colonization movement. And this becomes important in transporting essentially free African Americans from the United States to Liberia, whether they wanted to go or not. This is particularly the case after the 1840s, when, essentially after the Nat Turner Rebellion in the 1830s, many Southern states began to pass laws that barred the number of free African Americans that could live in a place. If a person was freed, they had to be relocated. And what many enslavers chose to do was to send them to Liberia or send them to other immigrant colonies, such as British Guiana or Sierra Leone. And these people here, the Berry and these others that were living along this coast close to Cote d'Ivoire, were resisting colonization. And I believe that they were essentially doing this act not as really as retribution for what happened on the Mary Carver, because they could have stopped at the Berry, but they didn't. And essentially they were forcing these people to submit to the colonization of Liberia, so that not only could they open trade routes along this part of the coast of Africa, but they could also make it easier for African American immigrants to settle there, which is something I'll get into a little bit more. Just checking the time. So we can learn a lot from these individual cases of slave ship owners and builders and captains who were involved in the slave trade. And one of these individuals was another individual who was a little bit later than Farwell, was Joseph Badger, who is from Brunswick. Joseph was born in 1791 in New Hampshire. He was part of the very famous Badger family. There's Badger Island in the Piscataqua River. He moved to Brunswick and lived on Main Street, which you can see here. He lived in the house of his brother, Nathaniel Badger, after his own house burned down in 1845. And he begins building ships in the 1830s. He is someone who was friends with the finest citizens of Brunswick. He was a close friend and financial benefactor of Joshua Chamberlain, for example. He was president of the Penobscot Bank for a number of years before his death, but he was also deeply involved in the slave trade. So he built at least 3 vessels that we know of that were involved in the slave trade, primarily to Brazil and Cuba. The first is the brig Porpoise, which I'll talk about in a minute, which was captured in Brazil in 1845. The second was the brig Malaga, which was captured in Angola in 1846, was released and was captured again in Sierra Leone in 1847 and raised by the British because of the conditions on board the vessel were so horrible for the enslaved people on board. People were suffocating in the hold before they even ever left the coast of Africa. And finally, the ship Rebecca, which I'll talk about shortly as well, which went to Cuba in 1859. He was also part owner of the brig Crimea of Bath, which transported 700 captive Africans to Cuba in 1857. So Badger essentially builds these vessels, and you can see sort of each subsequent vessel gets bigger and bigger, the finally being the Rebecca, which is quite a large ship at 534 tons capacity. So the first ship I'll talk about is the Porpoise, which was a brig known for being rakish. It was very fast. It was considered to be, when it was built at the height of shipbuilding technology, it was slim, it could turn quickly, it was, very well designed and well built. So it begins its journey in 1840 by leaving Baltimore. It goes down the coast of the US. It goes to Baltimore, picks up over 100 enslaved people from Baltimore and transports them to New Orleans. From there, it goes to Sao Tome, which is an island off the coast of Africa. which was a known site for the slave trade, either to purchase enslaved people directly or as a provisioning site between Africa and the Americas, as a site where you could buy water and other kinds of goods. And it goes to Africa under unknown circumstances, goes to Brazil, and then comes back to the United States. And it does this a couple of times. And in 1843, it goes to Angola on what is almost certainly a slave trading journey. And I know this because it was consigned by a very well-known slave trader in Brazil, meaning he essentially leased the vessel, which is they purchased the ship's charter, essentially. And so in 1844, it returns to Rio de Janeiro and goes and becomes part of a fleet of vessels traveling together to go to the east coast of Africa, to Mozambique. And these vessels are the Kentucky of Boston, which you saw an image of several slides back, which was the largest vessel traveling together. The Garafielia of Baltimore, the 17th of March, which probably is a fake name. A lot of times these vessels would change their name frequently in order to hide their true identities. And the Laguna of New York. So approximately 1,800 enslaved Africans were purchased on the east coast of Africa in late 1844. So these vessels were all consigned by a slave trader named Manuel Pinto da Fonseca. Fonseca was one of the largest and most prominent slave traders in all of Rio de Janeiro at the time. He not only traded enslaved people directly from Africa, he also owned his own auction facility. He owned plantations outside of Rio. He was making at least the equivalent of $20 million per year on selling enslaved people alone. We don't know the full numbers, of course, about his other activities, but the Fonseca family retained power throughout the period of the end of the monarchy and into the dictatorship period of Brazil, as well as into the period of democracy today. And there are still members of the Fonseca family who maintain a significant amount of power, wealth, and prestige. So this money has been inherited and passed down. And Fonseca was a very powerful man. He was considered a leader among the slave traders of Rio at this time period. And this list that you're seeing above here was, this is a transcription of a set of documents that's in the New York Public Library that were compiled by a man named George William Gordon, who was from Boston. He was a anti-slavery activist. He ran with William Lloyd Garrison and all of the other abolitionists of Boston. And he was appointed to be consul in the 1840s to Brazil. And he goes to Rio essentially with the idea that he's going to find these American ships that are acting indiscriminately and participating in the slave trade and try to do something about it. Unfortunately for Gordon, this case would lead to his firing by Tyler and President Tyler. And because essentially, Tyler was a slave holder himself and was not keen on the actions that Gordon was taking to try to suppress the slave trade. So essentially, approximately 1,800 enslaved Africans aboard these 5 vessels departed the Bay of Maputo in September of 1844. And aboard, the Porpoise was acting as pilot ship. So it was essentially acting as tender for the Kentucky in particular. It would sail up the smaller rivers. It would go along and check for naval forces and try to see if anyone was coming. So the Porpoise only had 3 enslaved people on board, 3 boys. And one of them you see here on the left was named Pedro Tovucan. And he was purchased along with his brother Luis, who was about 16 years old. Pedro was about 12 or 13. And there was another boy who was about the same age as Pedro named Guillermo. They were purchased to be the personal slaves of Manuel Fonseca and another man, Paulo Rodriguez, who was essentially, he was the supercargo. So he was kind of like the captain of all of the ships. He was, overseeing the journey. So they leave the Bay of Maputo in September 1844 and arrive in January 1845 in Rio de Janeiro with having sold all of the captives at a point east of Rio called Cabo Frio just prior. And the boys were still aboard the Porpoise. And so when the Kentucky pulls into the port of Rio de Janeiro, Gordon and the U.S. Navy ship that was there, the USS Raritan, which had been commissioned out of Philadelphia, were waiting for them. And the Kentucky pulled alongside the Raritan, and there was a free black cook aboard the Kentucky who was from New York. And he actually wrote a note that said there are 3 enslaved boys hidden aboard the Porpoise, and threw it on board the Raritan. And so the Porpoise was searched. They discovered Pedro, Guillermo, and Luis. The boys were deposed by Gordon and stated that, yes, we are enslaved. The captain of the Porpoise, Cyrus Libby, who was from Scarborough, tried to say, oh, we manumitted them. We gave them their freedom before they got on the ship. That was found to be weak evidence by Gordon, and Libby, as well as other crew members, were arrested. There was a huge incident between the U.S. government, the Navy ship, and the Brazilians at this time, because they also tried to arrest some Brazilian citizens for doing this, for participating in this journey. The Brazilians saw this as an affront to their sovereignty, given that it was taking place in Brazilian waters. However, essentially, Pedro and Guillermo were taken to the United States along with Libby, who was represented at trial by William Fessenden. And all of these documents exist in the Maine Historical Society. And was brought to Portland to stand trial. And so Pedro was adopted by Percival Paris, who was the U.S. Marshal for the state of Maine from Paris Hill. And Guillermo was adopted by the U.S. Marshal for the state of Massachusetts. And Luis, at 16, decided to join a merchant whaler crew and sort of disappears from the record. Pedro lived in Paris Hill until his death in 1860 from pneumonia. And we have a really remarkable record, not only of his experiences, how he was enslaved, how he lived in Paris Hill. He also painted a number of paintings, including a massive triptych of his experience that still exists. It's at the Historic New England. So this is a fascinating story where we have a firsthand account of an enslaved person who was caught up in this situation, not only an enslaved person, but an enslaved child, which is extremely rare. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Rebecca, which was another ship that was owned by Joseph Badger. This ship is interesting because it participated not only in the transportation of Africans from Africa to Cuba as part of the slave trade, but also as an immigrant ship, transporting free African Americans to Liberia. So, by the 1850s, Maine vessels were engaging in extremely high numbers in the illegal slave trade to Cuba in particular. So in the 1840s, it was primarily to Brazil. And this essentially ended because the Brazilians finally barred the importation of enslaved Africans from Africa to their country in 1850. That did not stop slavery in Brazil. Brazil continued to have slavery until 1888. And had a very robust intra-Brazilian slave trade, so a slave trade within Brazil. And of course, there were illegal landings there as well after 1850, but it did mostly stop in 1850. But after that, the slave traders just shifted to Cuba, and Cuba's sugar and developing guano trade with America in particular. Guano became a really important fertilizer in America, in the years leading up to the introduction of chemical fertilizers, as well as a high mortality rate and low life expectancy of enslaved people brought to work in Cuba in both types of industries. The average life expectancy in Cuba on a sugar plantation was only 7 years. So someone who was brought from Africa to Cuba could be expected not to live past 7 years in Cuba. This meant that American, in particular New England ships and merchants were making a massive amount of wealth engaging in these ventures. And Badger was one of these merchants. At the same time this was happening, many recently emancipated African Americans were being taken to Liberia as part of these colonization efforts that I spoke of previously. In some places in the South, white planters and governments feared that free African Americans would incite slave rebellions. So by the 1850s, vessels were regularly and often forcibly taking African Americans to Liberia. Some people did go voluntarily in the hope that they would be able to find a racist free Black society in Africa. But many of these people were, the vast majority of these people that were going there in this period were being transported not because they wanted to, but because they were being forced to go. But some of these vessels I've found were not taking their human cargoes where they were supposed to be taking them. The Rebecca is one of these ships. So it was built by Badger in 1845. And it was chartered by the American Colonization Society to, quote, take 42 people from New Orleans to Liberia, the liberated slaves of the late John McDonough. Essentially, McDonough was a planter from Georgia. When he died, he manumitted the enslaved people that lived on his plantation. And those 41 people plus another person that was liberated by someone else were to be taken to Liberia, to Monrovia, in April of 1859. This vessel was captained by a man named Carter, and a doctor on board the vessel became very suspicious that Carter was going to, in fact, instead of taking these people to Liberia, take these 42 free people, legally free people, and sell them as slaves in Cuba. After much protest, Carter eventually gave up and said, yes, I'll take them to Liberia, because the doctor threatened to turn him in. After all, this would be a capital offense, particularly a crime as grievous as this, with a witness as reliable as a ship surgeon, as a doctor. So, so the Rebecca landed these 42 people in Liberia, but then it cruised down the coast of Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire and purchased hundreds of enslaved Africans. They then turned around and sold them in Liberia, in Cuba. Apparently, the doctor would protest if they were selling free people from America, but not free people from Africa. So you can see in this newspaper article here, it's titled "Old Slaves Exchanged for New Ones." There was ship Rebecca, a new fast sailing Baltimore clipper. Baltimore clipper is the style of ship, not that it's from Baltimore, of 500 tons, commanded by Captain Carter, chartered by the American Colonization Society from New Orleans, arrived at Monrovia on the 2nd of July with 42 immigrants from the estate of the late McDonough. The suspicions of our citizens were somewhat aroused from several circumstances which took place while the ship was in port in reference to the character of the vessel and her ultimate destination. The report that the ship had on board all necessary fixtures to accommodate a full cargo of slaves, etc. And so we are not much surprised to learn today that from good authority that the Rebecca sailed from the southwest coast for the United States a few weeks ago with a full cargo of slaves. What happened to these parties? Nothing. No one ever suffered any consequences. Badger made a massive amount of money and was president of the Pejepscot Bank until his death in 1863. Badger used this wealth he made building ships intended for the slave trade to gather more wealth, more power, and prestige for himself and his family in the mid-coast area. Maine was not isolated from slavery and the slave trade. It was in fact deeply implicated and deeply complicit with both the foreign and domestic slave trades. And as such, we can see that it was really a building block of the New England economy. What I've discovered is that at least 18,000 people, and I've now updated that to 20,000 people, were transported from Africa to Cuba between 1850 and 1865. The average number of captives per ship was 647 people, so much higher than these earlier periods, meaning that the conditions on board were horrific for the enslaved people on board. The average sale price of a captive in Cuba at this time was approximately $400 per person, which equates to $12,000 per person today. And the profits for the journeys that I know about was at least 7.2 million at the time, or $151 million today. And the average net profits per owner for the owners was $3.1 million per journey. So the average estimated value of the New England slave fleet, which was estimated by the New York Times in 1857, was $332 million today. And this figure is likely too small, given that in my accounting, Maine vessels made at least that much money. And we only know about the iceberg. I only know about people who got caught. So that's an important thing to think about here, is that there's a whole underbelly of this where people never got caught. They will never know about what they did and how much money was actually being made and flowing back into New England. To put this in perspective, at the same time, in 1852, Maine's timber industry was valued at $2.5 million versus $11 million, which means that Maine's slave ship fleet was nearly 4 times more valuable than its timber industry in the 1850s, which is staggering, also considering that some of this timber also, of course, ended up in the slave trade, in either the vessels themselves or as trade goods. There was a robust trade of timber between New England and Cuba, for example. And you know, this newspaper article here in the middle from the Portland Advertiser really nails this home. That it states that 3 of these slave vessels recently captured and taken into Havana are said to have been built with Boston and Portland capital, and when captured, Eastern people were on board as officers and part of crews. Another of the vessels had been owned by parties in Massachusetts, Maine, and New York, and was sold with the knowledge that she was intended for the slave trade. One had 460 Africans on board and another 116. Let not the slave oligarchy despair. So long as Northern men can be found to carry on the African slave trade, there will be no difficulty in keeping up a pro-slavery political party at the North under the stimulus of the spoils of office. And so this is interesting, of course. This is all happening in the 1850s at this time when we are seeing this rise of anti-slavery propaganda in the North, that we are, you know, against slavery, that people are, you know, not essentially, you know, they're pushing against this idea that slavery is okay, and yet they're still heavily and deeply invested in slavery continuing outside of the United States as part of this trade, either directly in the trade of enslaved people or in the trade of enslaved goods produced by enslaved people, such as sugar, cotton, etc. So, you know, we can see this in others, and I'm going to have to move a little quickly through these folks. But Rufus Soule, who I spoke about earlier, was one of these folks. He was deeply invested in the coastwise slave trade. He's known as, you know, one of the founding shipbuilders and founding fathers of the town of Freeport. And he's said to have built 100 ships by his 65th birthday. And we've not really complicated the fact that how did he do this? How did he amass so much wealth? And well, you know, a lot of it came from not only the transportation of enslaved people, but also the transportation of goods produced by enslaved people. And much of this money that he made was directly from the Caribbean trade, from the trade of cotton in the South, and from bringing goods to those places. But he, you know, of course, also traded enslaved people directly aboard some of his ships, including the Susan Soule, which you can see on the right, and there's Susan in her portrait on the left, which is at the Freeport Historical Society. But I've also found that the Soules were likely involved in the illegal slave trade. And here's another ship that was supposed to have been going to Liberia on behalf of the American Colonization Society in 1850. It was consigned by a rather notorious slave ship captain, who I'll talk about in a moment, Frederick Drinkwater of Portland. Or rather, he was the captain of it, not consignee, and he was to transport these people from Savannah, 164 people from Savannah to Liberia in 1850, and the vessel returns from Liberia by way of Cuba in January 1851 with no cargo on board, and all it has is silver and gold. And what we can almost certainly assume is that this vessel was used as a slave ship, and this is one instance in which they got away with it without leaving direct evidence. But the fact that it was consigned by Drinkwater, who I'll talk about in a moment, and made this trip and returned empty of cargo, which wouldn't make any sense. You wouldn't just come back to the Northeast without sugar if you're going to Cuba, for example, or molasses or something like that. They also, later in the 1850s, the Rufus Soule, the brig Rufus Soule, which at this time in July 1858 was registered out of New Orleans, was consigned to a notorious slave dealer in Matanzas, Cuba, Cristobal Valdez, for about $5,000, which was a huge fee, almost twice as much a vessel of this size should have gotten at this time. C.J. Helm, the U.S. Consul General in Cuba, noted that the brig's captain and crew had taken all the usual measures to conceal their illegal activities. He stated, quote, "All the entries in the several records books, the ship's daily journal, the fee book, and the detailed list of seamen ship discharged or deceased show the foregoing facts." So the consul was aware that this slave trading journey was going to happen before they left, but he felt unable to stop it. Helm noted that during the same time period, British cruisers were boarding American vessels in Matanzas, which caused a great uproar in the United States about the right of search and seizure of American vessels at sea. Helm posited that this is a reason why the American consul was inactive. He didn't do anything, but we might interpret this differently today as being complicit in these activities. During the week of October 10th, 1858, the British cruiser Viper sighted the Rufus Soule sitting in Cabenda Bay, Angola. The Viper had already captured the Kate Ellen, a schooner from Plymouth, on September 15th, outfitted as a slaver. The British commander ordered the ship boarded on the evening of October 11th and burned the vessel in the bay. By the next morning, it hadn't sunk, so they blasted it with cannon fire until it did. In his report, Commodore Wise of the British Naval Forces noted that, quote, the American captain, by his own confession, was merely a tool in the hands of Spaniards to carry out the farce of her being a legal American trader. And this caused quite an incident between the United States and Great Britain. The Americans saw this as an affront to the sovereignty of American vessels at sea, which essentially are like, when a vessel's at sea, it's an extension of that country. The laws are that the citizens are living under are part of are active aboard the vessel. So the Soul is sunk, and not before, though. It likely had made other previous slave trading journeys to Cuba prior to this and made significant amount of money, as I talked about previously. So, Drinkwater is a really interesting character, and probably the worst slaver that I have ever discovered. He was born August 3rd, 1817 in Portland. He was the son of ship captain David Drinkwater Jr., who was part of the famous Drinkwater family of North Yarmouth. The Drinkwaters were wealthy, connected maritime men and ship captains. Frederick married Jane B. Milliken, who was the daughter of David's business colleague at the Bank of Cumberland, Weston Milliken, in 1842. They settled into a home on Cumberland Ave on Munjoy Hill in Portland. By 1850, Frederick was deeply involved in the slave trade to Cuba, working on behalf of Maine merchants and ship owners. The first vessel that Drinkwater captained under these suspicious circumstances was the Chieftain, which I talked about previously. And he also captained the Susan Soul in 1850 to 1851 and made a journey to Havana under unknown circumstances, though given his track record, we can only assume what he was doing in Havana. So Drinkwater makes all these connections in Havana, and it decides that he's going to get in bed with these slave traders. He also made connections in Liberia, and he became a favorite captain for the recruitment of New England slave ships for the Cuban slave trade in the 1850s. Between 1850 and 1860, he was the registered captain of all these vessels that you see here: the Chieftain, the Susan Soul, the Florina, the Gambia, the Cosmopolitan, the Minnetonka, the Joseph H. Record, the R.B. Lawton, the Niagara, the Brahmin, the Abbott Devereux, and the Minnetonka. It was noted in the accounts and papers of the British House of Commons that we understand, quote, we understand an American citizen by the name of Drinkwater, calling himself a resident at Portland, is the purchaser of almost all of these American vessels and figures as their outfitter, but there can be little doubt that this person is only put forth by the slave traders to cover their transactions. He was also the captain of several other vessels that were operating suspiciously during the late 1840s and early 1850s, including several which were struck by devastating yellow fever outbreaks, a likely sign of slave trading. By 1857, he partially relocated to Havana, working directly with the Spanish and Portuguese slave traders that were operating between New York, Boston, and Havana. Drinkwater's activities were so blatant and unchecked that despite the knowledge of the American and British authorities, Drinkwater did not suffer any legal consequences. And you can see in this is another British report, this quote here: "It is well known some months ago that an American who passed by the name of Captain Drinkwater and stated himself to belong to Portland in the state of Maine was engaged in the purchase of fast-sailing vessels, that he bought a number of them here, which were supposed to be intended for the slave trade, and several of those purchased by him have subsequently been fallen in with and been captured and condemned off the coast of Africa." Drinkwater is responsible alone for the transportation of at least 10,000 people to Cuba during this time period. So he's a significantly active slave trader, and nothing ever happens to him. He dies peacefully at home in the 1870s of liver failure. And this is a theme that we see throughout, and this is a list which I'm sure you can't read, but this is a list of all of the main vessels that I've identified that have made trips to Africa. slave trading trips in the 1850s between Africa and Cuba. And at least 18,000 people were transported. I only have numbers for about half of them. So, you know, this number is likely significantly higher. And that's essentially my talk. Here's a little bit more about the work that we do at the Center for the Study of Global Slavery at the Smithsonian. And I encourage you to check out our website. We've got resources up there, some really interesting stuff about this global slave trade and slavery.
Kate, thank you very much for the talk. It was enlightening, and we do appreciate you zooming in.